I would like to invite Mr. Gordon Gillerman, who's the director of the Standards Coordination Office at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and Department of Commerce Standards Executive. So he leads NIST's work in standards coordination and the National Voluntary Laboratory Accreditation Program. And Gordon supports extensive standards development and advises federal agencies and other stakeholders on standards and conformity assessment policy. He'll be sharing with us today some broader activities and initiatives from the interagency, just across the federal government. So, Mr. Gillerman.
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me here, and congratulations on the 70th anniversary. This is a great event. I always enjoy when I can participating in this event. We are the National Institute of Standards and Technology at NIST, and we are this country's National Metrology Institute. So we're the connection to measurement units of the world, not the weather people. That's NOAA, a different part of the Department of Commerce. We're also a technology research and development organization, doing advanced technology research in communications technology, information technology, and engineering, mostly focused on building and construction, but as well as looking at natural disaster mitigation for the built environment. It's really interesting. I was doing a little bit of looking at the connection between DoD and NIST. So time is a connection between DoD and NIST. If you look at your cell phone right now and you check the time comes from NIST Boulder, Colorado time sync. If you're on a military vessel and you check the time, it comes, I think, from the Naval Observatory. And the times are working together. Some of the most advanced timekeeping apparatus in the world exists in this country because of cooperative efforts between NIST and DoD. The Naval Undersea Warfare Laboratory is a designated institute for underwater acoustic measurements, designated by us because we're the connection to the International Metrology System, and you folks have the capability. So we've worked together to make sure that the quality of those measurements and the uncertainty of those measurements is best of practice. And at a more local level, to me, an organization that's under the Standards Coordination Office, the National Voluntary Laboratory Accreditation Program, has recently created an accreditation program for federal warfare systems testing. So the Air Combat Command Federal Research Laboratory is the only NAVLAP accredited laboratory for that scope of accreditation. So these are some of the things that kind of bind us together in our work in standards and metrology. It's been mentioned, this thing called voluntary consensus standards, and it's really interesting because really the DoD was the lead. There's a law called the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act. It has a really lot to say about how you accomplish tech transfer from the federal government out into the private sector, and 2 short paragraphs on standards that have really become the guiding light of standards policy in the US government. And they're pretty simple. It says the government shall participate in the development of these voluntary consensus standards and use them in lieu of government unique standards whenever you can meet your mission needs that way. It also gives NIST a role in coordinating this participation and use of standards across the federal government and with the private sector, and an even wonkier role in coordinating conformity assessment across the government and with the private sector. So conformity assessment is our code word for all things related to accreditation, testing, and certification. And it's really interesting because the focus of all the agency's mission is diverse. But one thing that's really interesting now is the things that are beginning to bind us together in the digital transformation age. So there are things that touch us all: cybersecurity, privacy, the future of artificial intelligence, and one day, quantum computing. And these things cut across agency missions and technology needs really like almost nothing ever has in our history. And so the need to be coordinated across the federal government as we participate in these standards, and we participate as stakeholders, I think Michael made that point really well, is we don't go into a standards development organization to dominate the standards development process. We go in to share our intellect and our science and our discipline, and we go in to learn from others in the process. And hopefully what we get out is fit for purpose standardization efforts that can serve all the sectors in the private sector, as well as most of the government uses. So the director of NIST has delegated all that crazy coordination work to me as the director of the Standards Coordination Office. Just a quick rundown of what we do. So we operate the only government laboratory accreditation organization in the US. We're a member of the International Accreditation Cooperations in order to have a demonstration that we operate in accordance with international standards and to make sure that the laboratories that are accredited under our programs, test results, can be accepted broadly around the world. We coordinate through a committee called the Interagency Committee on Standards Policy, where all the federal government agency standards executives come to share best practices and more influence federal policy on standards. Michael is the DoD's primary representative there, and I'm the Department of Commerce's standards executive. We've begun to look at how we can be more effective in this work. And so we've begun to develop some sector-specific or technology-specific working groups. We now have working groups on advanced communications technologies, artificial intelligence, and a very long-standing one on conformity assessment. And it's interesting how much that all touches our lives. So if you go into the hardware store and you buy an appliance and it has an Energy Star mark on it, there's people at the EPA who are operating a conformity assessment program for energy-saving electrical appliances. If you see water sense marks on products, you see water-saving plumbing products, also operated by the EPA. Dr. Honey mentioned one of my favorite subjects, which is body armor. So the National Institute of Justice operates a body armor certification program. They are also a member of this conformity assessment working group. I'll talk a little bit more about NIST's role in that program to show you some of the things that we do as we move along. We also operate a pretty large-scale US government training operation for standards and conformity assessment issues. Staff from across the government participate nowadays virtually, in the past in person, in our training activities. And we train them both on what does the standard system look like? How can you participate effectively in it? And then we train them on the skills of influence in standards. It's not just enough to show up and take your seat. You have to understand how to make your point and how to build consensus in standardization. And often that set of soft skills is more important than being the smartest person in the room. We're beginning to offer new services on developing strategic standardization information across the US government. The world of standards moves kind of slow, but not as slow as the federal government moves. And so as the primary coordinator for standardization across the government, people from other agencies, the DOT, will come to me and say, the International Organization for Standardization has developed this new work item proposal, and we don't like it. We want it defeated. And my first question is, so when's the ballot on the NWIP? And the answer is 2 weeks ago, because we just found out. That's not good enough anymore. Because those new work item proposals are coming from the PRC in critical and emerging technologies. So we have to turn the clock back on US government awareness about what's happening in the international standard system, provide timely and effective information across the federal government on standards that can be actionable by staff and agencies. This is a really challenging thing to do. There is a lot of standardization activities happening, and they're happening in a diverse set of organizations. And the transparency of these organizations is all different. How you know about what's going on is different. How we know about what's going on in the International Organization for Standardization, most people call it ISO, or the International Electrotechnical Committee, IEC, is easy. We're members through the American National Standards Institute. You can see it online. But how do you know what's going to happen in 3GPP or the Internet Engineering Task Force? You almost have to be there. So how do we tap that human intelligence in standards and make it available across the government, again, in an actionable way? We are starting the program. We call it International Standards Alert. It is available to all U.S. government employees. So if you're a USG employee and you want to be a subscriber to International Standards Alert, send an email to gordongillerman@nist.gov, and I'll get you subscribed to the list. The product that you see now looks like a painful information dump, but I've now got 2 professionals on board, and they're going to transform this product into directed information. So you can see what's important to you, see it in a strategic way, and see it in time to take action. We also have a significant role in trade. International trade and standards have a tremendous interdependency. 93% of all products that cross borders are required to meet standards in one way or another, either required by the regulatory systems of the countries they're going to be sold in or required by the marketplace. Walmart and Costco have their own supply chains and their own requirements to be on the shelves of their stores here and their peer stores in other countries. We also provide a significant amount of consulting to the federal agencies. We do matchmakings with the right standards development organizations for specific subject areas. When their mission and ours is closely aligned, we roll up our sleeves and jump in. We also provide a lot of consulting. As a matter of fact, this is becoming our biggest business in the development of testing and certification programs for government agencies. So if you live near Washington, D.C., and you listen to the news radio, you've probably heard FedRAMP. Everybody who's heard the term FedRAMP, raise your hand. So anybody know what it is? So FedRAMP is this U.S. government's cloud computing service certification program that demonstrates that cloud computing service providers meet the minimum security requirements to be procured by government agencies. The original FedRAMP certification process was stood up by NIST for GSA. Dr. Honey mentioned the body armor program and how proud he is that this body armor program can actually serve both the defense community and the law enforcement community, is based on voluntary consensus standards. So when I was born into NIST, this was one of the very first things that I got involved in. We identified a better way to make standards than having the Justice Department write the standards. We worked with ASTM International. We developed a modular approach to developing performance standards for the various parts of the tremendously complicated test method for body armor. We worked with the Department of Justice to reform their laboratory approval program into a formal laboratory accreditation program, now operated by NAVLab. And we reformed their certification process to be best in class and aligned with the international standards for certifying products. This has resulted in a collection of ASTM standards that can individually be revised, and all of it agnostic on threats. So it can serve law enforcement and evolve as their threat portfolio evolves, and serve the units of DoD who have their own threat portfolios to worry about. This is really being a transformative program, both in policy and in fact and operation. The laboratories that Dr. Honey talked about are NAVLab accredited laboratories. They're demonstrated to meet international standards for laboratory operation, to be competent at carrying out the specific tests required by this set of standards for body armor performance. These are important qualities for a system that gives us confidence in life-saving equipment. And just recently, we worked over about 2.5 years with the Food and Drug Administration to stand up a program for the FDA's accreditation of private laboratories to allow the FDA to take advantage of the engineering approaches to solving some of the regulatory compliance issues for medical devices. For the first time ever, a medical device manufacturer who applies for approval to the FDA can go to a private sector accredited laboratory, have their tests done to FDA recognized standards, and when they submit for approval of their medical devices through the FDA regulatory process, The clinicians who do most of the approval process don't have to worry about things like electromagnetic compatibility or electrical safety or interoperability of digital systems, because those can be tested in laboratories and demonstrated. They worry about the safety and effectiveness of the device from a clinical perspective where their expertise is. We're hoping that as this program rolls out, we can move the FDA's regulatory device approval system from an average about 120 days down to something lean, like maybe 90 days. This will bring needed medical devices to all of us more quickly. So this is a pretty good synopsis of the collection of stuff that we do in the Standards Coordination Office at NIST. And our job is really to serve the federal enterprise in standardization. I'll note that a couple of references have been made to the China's plan on standards. Well, really the PRC published Standards 2035 several years ago. And it's clear that they understand that standards leadership and technology leadership are connected at the hip. They are ever more present in standardization in the most important international standards development forums. We struggle to have that kind of presence across the entire continuum. It's interesting how many of my observations have already been mentioned. One of the other observations that we have is that documentary standards development used to begin when the private sector could see technology commercialization over the horizon. Maybe TRL 7, the way most of you folks look at it. Documentary standards is closing in on TRL 0. And not only is it closing in on TRL 0, but the number of sandboxes to go play in is multiplying. The standards development organizations around the world want to be relevant in technologies like AI and quantum. So they're opening up standards development projects early. And the PRC is highly motivated to take leadership roles in these standards development projects and drop new work items, create new technical committees. It's a real challenge for us. So what do we need to do? We need to enhance US government and private sector coordination. We need to share more information across the government and across the government with the private sector, because as you heard today, we have a private sector-led standard system. It's interesting. In some ways, it might seem like this is a bit of a handicap, but actually it's our saving grace. The nimbleness of our standardization approach has given us an edge in technology leadership. We have to do everything we can to reinforce our capability and our private sector's capability to be present, to be effective, to be influential in standardization. And then it includes the governance roles. This is something I think many of us struggle with understanding the value proposition of. Why would I want to go and spend a tremendous amount of travel time and travel budget to go to the governance of the International Standardization Organization and play a significant role in how the rules of the road for standardization are going to be met in the future? Because that's where we all need to be. We need to be making sure that the standardization system continues to filter out the junk from the system, to identify the best-in-class technical contributions to standards, and publish fit-for-purpose standards that don't unduly advantage any country or any particular technology. I listened to a podcast from these gentlemen from the CSIS called The Trade Guys, because a lot of my work is intersecting with trade. And one of them says it very plainly. In our technological competition with China, we have two basic choices. We can try to trip them, or we can run faster. Tripping them is not going to work. The international standardization system is open to all and wants participation. It draws in participation. So attempts to trip the Chinese in standards are going to set us back in standards. We have to learn how to run even faster in standards. We have to focus inside of the US government to enhance our capabilities of participating in standards. Even at a place like NIST, where standards is in our name, it's a challenge for the staff to understand the benefit to me and my career of being influential in standardization. We're researchers. We like to publish papers and peer-reviewed articles. There's a system to count how many people leverage peer-reviewed articles. There's not really a system to know that I was involved in the development of IEEE 802.11. Anybody know what that is? Raise your hand. Wi-Fi, right? And everybody who's not paying attention to me and is on their computer is probably using that standard right now, right? So transformative, right? Wi-Fi allowed us to lose the LAN connection, lose the dial-up modem, and be free to wirelessly connect with the greatest information source ever. So it in itself was an innovation. But Wi-Fi has been a platform for some of the most amazing innovation in the last decade. I woke up this morning and my bed, again, I can never stop it. It tried to tell me how good my sleep was last night. And it did so because it's connected to my home network through Wi-Fi. And 2 days ago, my phone buzzed and I looked at it, and it was a picture while I was away for the weekend of my son's girlfriend showing up at my house, right? Another innovation. Now, he's 25 and she's 26, so it's all right. But really, and you can think of in your own lives, right? What Wi-Fi has enabled in innovative technology that you use in your personal life, but also here in the DoD. It's an amazing platform and has sponsored innovations. There was a war between what is now Wi-Fi 802.11 and something called WAPI. WAPI was the Chinese answer to wireless internet connectivity. And it lost in the standards war because it was an inferior technology, not because it was from China and not from the United States. So using the engine of US research and development and not using that engine to drive leadership in standards would be a mistake for us at this point in time. Our own engagement isn't enough in the government. We have to help the private sector see the value of its engagement in standards in this ever rapidly evolving world of technology. Making the decision to send your smartest people to standards engagements that can take significant amount of resources to develop those international standards that the world bases its technology changes on is really important, right? It used to be, I think, a lot clearer to see. I think for the private sector companies, it's more challenging than it's ever been. So we have a focus in a lot of areas on international standards, ISO, IEC, 3GPP, the Internet Engineering Task Force. These are all really interesting standardization forums, and they're all operating pretty well. We also have a lot of focus these days on ITU-T. So ITU is an organization that's under the umbrella of the United Nations. It's a different kind of standards body because the members are government members. For the United States, the State Department is the representative in ITU-T. And ITU is actually split into three pieces. There's the R piece for radio communications, the T piece for telecommunications and technology, and the D piece for the developing countries. The R piece seems to be functioning pretty well, but the expansion of the portfolio of work in ITU-T over the past decade has been concerning. They're taking on work that seems far afield from telecommunications, and they've been under Chinese leadership for 8 years. There's an election coming up this fall. Likely outcome is that there will be US leadership in ITU-T going forward. Part of this country's commitment to be present and relevant in the most important places in standardization. And one of the things I think we also don't take advantage of is our power in grants and awards. So my little organization inside of NIST just had its 13th year of giving standards education grants, where we grant money to universities and colleges to develop curricula that include standards in higher education. We spent the most money we ever did this year. We spent $500,000. We're spitting in that ocean. China has 2 universities where you can get a master's degree in standardization. You can't escape STEM education without understanding why standards are important. And they're driving standards education down even lower into high school equivalent and beyond. Korea is doing the same thing. It was interesting. I heard the gentleman from the Navy say that, you know, he wasn't a good basketball player, so he became an electrical engineer. I had this dream of being an audio engineer or even a sound man for, like, you know, bands back then. And my dad said, go get an engineering degree, and then if you want to do that, it's great. So I graduated as an electrical engineer, and I went to school and started working for Underwriters Laboratories right out of school. So I had a career change as well, I think for the better. And it's really interesting because 4 years in electrical engineering, I became a member of IEEE because it cost $10. I got a free t-shirt and I got to put on my resume. I never saw a standard until the first day I showed up at UL for work. Electrical engineers don't understand standards coming out of school. Really? Can you think of a career where you really need to understand what standardization is in industry and how it works and why it's important more than electrical engineering? Maybe civil engineering is the more important place for it, perhaps. And as I really look across universities, because we do a lot of work, I do a lot of lecturing. I'm a free lecturer for universities all the time. Fire protection engineering is almost unique in their focus on standardization. University of Maryland has a great program, but it really still is a desert of standards education, even in STEM. And the even harder part of this to swallow is if you look at leadership in technology companies. It's not engineers and scientists anymore. It's financial professionals and lawyers. So that decision-making about whether to deploy bottom line resources into standardization needs even more educational help to understand the value of it to them, to their companies, to their employees, and to our country. We also need to think about standardization activities as a selection factor in research grants. So NIST gives out some research grants, the NSF gives out lots of research grants. One of the things I rarely see is that part of the points you get in your application for that grant money is whether you're going to participate in standards in this technology area, whether you're going to use that R&D resource, whether the professors who get this will find themselves in standardization and maybe drag their students into standardization. Maybe that's another approach to bringing standardization to the next generation. I'm also at the forefront now of working in cooperative relationships with our friends and allies on standardization. So I lead the working group on standards under the US European Union Trade and Technology Council on standards. We're focused on things like cooperating in artificial intelligence standardization within the work of JTC1, which is a joint committee of ISO and IEC. We're also focused on coordinating ourselves in work that happens in the ITU, sometimes defensive, sometimes productive. I'm also leading with the State Department with the Quad countries. Interesting, because I did a little research on the Quad itself, and the Quad wasn't started as a technology cooperation. It was started as defense cooperation, and now it's evolved and has technology cooperation becoming an integral part of our cooperation with Japan, India, and Australia. And we're focused on many of these same subjects: quantum computing, artificial intelligence, but we're also focused on things related to recycling of plastics and climate. But this ability to work with other countries, to harness the power of democratic countries around the world and the way we think about technology and technologies used in society is going to be an even more important in the future as we try to counter the influence of organizations and people and individuals who bring more malign subject matters into the standards arena. And I think one of the things I heard today, and Michael said it, is what we really, really need to focus on is our standard savvy workforce for the future. Because we're all getting old. Everybody in standards is getting old. And we need to find a way to connect the importance of standards to the next generation of professionals, both in science and engineering and across the board, and help them understand why this field, whether it's something you do every day of your life like I do, or whether it's something you do as part of some other portfolio of work, is so important to our future. I appreciate the time spent with me today. Thank you.